Good afternoon and welcome to this virtual panel organized in the framework of Rome-Med Mediterranean Dialogues, the year-long initiative co-promoted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. This year-long initiative culminates in the annual conference at the start of November, and this year marks the 9th edition of Rome-Med. Well, today we turn the spotlight on the relations between the European Union and the Middle Eastern and North African countries in an era marked by global challenges, exacerbated by the effects of the war in Ukraine, as well as tensions between Russia and the West. As we know, the MENA region's stability and prosperity is crucial for the EU, that since the Barcelona process in 1995 has engaged in developing policies to promote peace, stability, and prosperity in its southern neighborhood. However, its efforts have not always provided concrete results, and EU action has not always lived up to its ambitious targets. In the region, the EU is mainly considered as an economic partner and the main provider of development aid and humanitarian assistance, with a limited geopolitical role, while other players, other actors have increased their presence and influence in the area over the years. So, against this backdrop, many questions have been raised regarding the future of EU-MENA relations, especially in the wake of the war in Ukraine, that has significant implications for both the EU and the region at the geopolitical, geostrategic, and socio-economic level. I stop here after this brief introduction, and I'm delighted to introduce the distinguished speakers that are with us this afternoon. I'm glad to introduce Hélène Lagal, Managing Director for the Middle East and North Africa at the European External Action Service. Welcome. And Dalia Ghanem, Senior Analyst for the Middle East and North Africa at the European Institute for Security Studies in Paris. Welcome, Dalia. And last but not least, Eduard Lecha, Associate Professor at the Autonomous University in Barcelona and Associate Senior Researcher at the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, CIDOB. Welcome, Eduard. So my first question is to Hélène Lagal, and I'd like to ask her, how is the war in Ukraine impacting the EU strategy in the Middle Eastern and North African countries? What are the security, political, and economic implications? So, Madame Lagal, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Valeria, and good afternoon to all. 1 year after the Russian aggression in Ukraine, we can obviously see and feel some of the most pressing repercussions in the MENA regions, like inflation, disruptions in trade flows, and supply shortages of grain and fertilizers, leading to rises prices for food and energy, but also consequences which are not negative. For example, oil and gas producers of the MENA region, like Gulf countries or Algeria, have benefited from increased revenue since the beginning of the war, which gives them more leverage in the region and more generally internationally. So dealing with the global consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is one of the main main priority in foreign policy for the EU. We have been taking both economic and humanitarian measures, short-term and long-term. We have adopted an EU global action plan to address the geopolitical consequences of the conflict. These action plans identify priority countries, among them countries from the MENA region. To support those countries, we have intensifying our political dialogues, expanded our policy responses, and mobilized some funds and financial instruments. To address the immediate consequences of the food crisis, we have established a Southern Neighborhood Food and Resilience Facility, which has provided 225 million euros to 8 countries of the MENA region. We are also continuing, of course, our long-term support. When it comes to energy, we are taking action to support initiatives to improve energy cooperation between the EU and the MENA countries. Of course, the idea is to increase energy exports from these countries to the EU, including, of course, hydrocarbons, but also hydrogen and green electricity. Of course, we have for that agreements with the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean region. We have partnership also with some countries of the MENA region like Egypt or Morocco in green hydrogen or in the Green Deal. There are also possible developments in the field of values chains. Finally, I want to reiterate that we remain firmly committed to the resolutions of conflicts in the MENA region and towards Southern Neighborhood. The region is heavily targeted by Russian disinformation campaigns aiming to exploit existing anti-Western sentiments and spreading the Russian narrative on the war. Of course, this disinformation has fueled anti-European sentiments and also blaming the Western sanctions for the growing food insecurity, for example. The EU is still committed and active in conflict resolution, and we are supporting our partner countries in the south. For example, we still advocate for the revitalization of the Middle East peace process, in particular through the activity of the EU Special Representative for the Middle East peace process. We call for de-escalation in that part of the world, and of course for re-establishing a political horizon on the two-state solutions. And we know that we are the main supporters, the bigger donor to both the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA. Syria also remains a key priority for the EU. The 7th Brussels conference will take place on the 15th of June with a day of dialogue the day before. It's an example of the EU continuous commitment to the conflict in spite of other crises like Ukraine. And we hope to get some pledges together head to the Syrians inside the country, of course, also in the framework of the earthquake. There will be another conference on the 20th of March together with Turkey. But for the conference of June, we will also speak about our support to the neighboring states that are hosting Syrian communities like Lebanon and Jordan, for example. More broadly, in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, we have always supported to the best of our ability the efforts of the UN. We remaining a vocal actor in this commitment to the international order, the rule of law, and the support of the UN system. We continuously stress the importance of having this efficient multilateral system founded on universal values and values to cope with all current crises. So to conclude, the region is impacted by the Russian aggression, but this is being complicated by the interconnected of the war with climate change, migration crisis, conflict, inflation. At the same time, it opens also the way to new opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hélène. So, Dalia, I'd like to turn to you. Hélène already mentioned some of the implication of the war in Ukraine on MENA countries. And with you, I would like to go more in details on about the impacts of the war and how can this implication affect relations between the EU and MENA countries? So please, Dalia.
Sure. Thank you, Valeria. As Hélène said, every country in the MENA region hasn't been impacted the same, and some countries are benefiting from the war. She cited the case of GCC countries and Algeria, and this is exactly what I was going to talk about. So the war has produced winners among oil-producing countries and gas-producing countries, which is the case of Algeria and GCC. So in North Africa, I would say Algeria is, for now, to a certain extent, a winner, between quotes, of course, while in the Middle East, I will talk about the GCC. So Algeria is right now, in a state of grace, what I call a state of grace. This is a country that has been, invisible to a certain extent for the last decade due to political instability and due to the long illness of former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika. And so, with the war in Ukraine, Algiers actually witnessed an outpouring visits from EU officials. We've seen Mario Draghi to Meloni, to Macron, to Elisabeth Borne and Charles Michel. European Council President Charles Michel also visited Algeria and said about the country that it is a strong and reliable energy partner. So the country used the war in Ukraine actually to increase its gas supplies to Europe and specifically to Italy. And the country increased its gas export by twofold to 100 BCM in 2022, which wasn't the case since 1999. So Algeria is now meeting 12% of the EU gas requirement against 10% before the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So in a nutshell, the country is really riding high with oil and gas revenues exceeding $58 billion in 2022 against compared to 34 billion in 2021. And so the country is using this, oil bonanza to, convert it to a certain extent to a capital, to political capital by using it to re-emerge after years of stagnation, as I said. And of course, there is, this more assertive foreign policy. We've seen Algeria organizing the summit of the League of Arab States last November. We've seen Algeria organizing the Mediterranean Games. And of course, we've seen what happened with Spain when Algeria decided to cut ties with Spain following the declaration of Spain to get out of 45 years of neutrality towards the Western Saharan issue. And so when it comes to this North African country, we have Russia that has been an old historical ally. And of course, a security partner. Let us not forget that between 2017 and 2021, 81% of weapons came from Russia. And Algeria is a very important also security player in North Africa, but also in the Sahel region. And so the question is, for now, the country has been really good, if I may say, at, having this very well-calibrated stance to a certain extent between not upsetting Brussels, but not also upsetting Moscow. But the question is, until when can Algeria continue in this, what some call positive neutrality? I think there was already reactions in the EU Parliament about some parliamentarians and also in Washington, D.C. about some U.S. MPs calling for sanctions against Algeria because the country abstained from voting at the UN each time it has the chance. So the other winner, and we are moving west, GCC countries, I would say they are the other winners of this war. I would say if, while in 2011, and I am referring here to the Arab Spring, while in 2011, some GCC countries such as Qatar, UAE, and KSA were able to influence the local political and economic future of countries who previously had much more geopolitically relevant weight than them. The war in Ukraine allowed the GCC country to have a weight at the international level. And so the GCC became a more influential actor in the energy market. And they also knew how to convert this oil bonanza into political capital. And today I would say, that this boosted their confidence, and you can feel that they are taking stances that what they deem fit politically for them. And this is the first time we've seen that, this allowed them to define their policies as they see fit. And actually, some of them defied the US. And I think, and I will take the words of a US political insider who said, quote unquote, the US is no longer in town. I think this is true when it comes to the Middle East and GCC countries, where we can see that there is no more influence like it used before. There is also a very strong anti-US sentiment in the region. Also, on the food security problem, that hit the majority of countries. I'm thinking here about Lebanon, about Tunisia, about Egypt, and I can come back to that later. But the GCC were quick to answer. At the very beginning of the war, they were able to buy a lot of grains due to their financial means, but also it should be noted that many developed agriculture through the last decade. For instance, Qatar did not wait for the war in Ukraine because it suffered from the blockades in 2017 onwards. And so they developed their agriculture and invested more than $40 billion and have been able to grow vegetables in the desert. So they haven't been hit in the same way. And I will stop on that. On the economic side, the IMF predicts that the GCC countries are going to have 1.3 billion of extra reserve over the next 4 years. So I would say that to a certain extent, there will be stability in this region of the Middle East and North Africa. However, I think the spirit of revolt is still very vivid, and it will probably hit North African and Middle Eastern countries. I'm thinking here about Iraq, about Lebanon, about Tunisia, and this will be probably the third wave of the Arab Spring.
Thank you, Dalia. Let's turn now to Eduard, and I'd like to ask you how and to what extent are MENA countries' civil societies' perception of the war in Ukraine affecting the relationship between the EU and the government in the region?
Well, if I would have only a few seconds, I would say not much, because it's not that civil societies in many MENA countries are able to shape the decisions of their respective rulers or regimes. Having said that, I think it's a good occasion to stop a little bit and understand how societies within the MENA region are perceiving and reacting to the developments in Ukraine. In that respect, probably as Europeans, what we may be very surprised when traveling to the region or to other parts of the world, be it Latin America or Southeast Asia or any other areas, is how little the crisis in Ukraine is being discussed, and I would say even covered in the media, in the digital conversations. Very often it is portrayed as a European war, as a European problem. It doesn't concern them, even if it concerns them, as we know and as we've been discussing. The second point is that very often when Ukraine is being discussed, an idea that comes to the mind of many people is the idea of double standards. Now Europeans are asking us to support them in the fight, the legitimate fight, of the Ukrainians for sovereignty, for freedom, and against the occupation. Well, imagine you are a Palestinian. And then you are bringing the idea of occupation to the forefront and the right of resistance. So it also tells us to what extent our discussion, our framing of the war in Ukraine is reviving among many citizens in the other side of the Mediterranean this old grievance of European double standards. And then these, I would say, also refugees and migration, mainly refugees, the generous, and I think it's good that the European Union and its societies and countries were generous and ambitious also in the response, in the humanitarian response to the refugee crisis emanating from the Russian occupation of Ukraine. In a way, it has also contributed to this whole idea of the double standards. Yet then, regarding the consequences of the war in Ukraine, I would like also here to support, I would say, what my predecessors have already said, the idea that, well, this may be a geopolitical region from the Atlantic to the Gulf, but that we have very different realities, societal, economic realities, and the way in which the consequences of the war in Ukraine, even if it's not framed as the consequences of the war in Ukraine, it's very different in countries that are facing enormous difficulties, enormous economic difficulties, such as Tunisia, Lebanon, and at a different level, perhaps Egypt and Turkey, compared to those that have been able to afford social policies and also measures also to counterbalance somehow the negative consequences of the war in Ukraine, which, as we have already said, this is mainly the oil-producing countries. So to summarize, it is not as discussed as it is in our cities in Europe. The idea of double standards, and it is very different depending on whether you are speaking to a Tunisian, to a Lebanese, to a Saudi, or to an Algerian.
Thank you, Eduard. So in the region, the war in Ukraine is perceived mainly as a European war, far away, and as you mentioned, the double standard has been, the idea of the double standard, very spread in public opinion, of course, with differences, and it has produced also two different systems of asylum in Europe, one for Ukrainians and the other for other.
The rest.
For the rest, for others. So let's back to Hélène, and we would like to ask you which role does the MENA region play in the framework of the EU global strategy? So the strategy that goes beyond a wide vision, wide global vision for the EU. Hélène, can you hear me?
Sorry, I was still muted. In the global context we described earlier with the Russian aggression to Ukraine, my utmost concern as managing director for the Middle East and North Africa here at the EEAS is to show that the EU is still engaged and active with the southern partners and also with the Gulf, and that the EU doesn't shy away from its responsibilities. So we have articulated this into three priorities for the year 2023. The first one is to strengthen and deepen the EU Gulf relations along the lines of the joint communication we adopted last year on the Gulf. With the opening of EU delegation in all the countries of the Gulf, there is an active need to enhance the already strong EU-Gulf relation and building on the mutual interest in a long-term strategic partnership. We will continue to deepen and widen the cooperation and reinforce the position and the image of the EU in the region, and in many fields, from energy to security, from climate change to trade. This is done very actively through an extensive dialogue at all levels, bilaterally with all the countries of the Gulf, but also between EU and GCC. And you probably have seen the numbers of visits, of high-level visits in both directions. The second priority is to strengthen the link with the southern neighborhood and promote a regional approach through a regional organization existing. We have to effectively implement our new agenda for the Mediterranean and to assess our partnership with our southern neighbors, as well as the formats and the instruments we have with this partnership. The EU southern neighborhood is the EU priority. It's also an approach promoted by President van der Leyen at the EU summit when launching the Africa-Europe investment package as part of the Global Gateway initiative. This partnership between the two shores of the Mediterranean is through digital transformation and high-speed digital connectivity with projects like Medusa, connecting 9 countries, north or south of the Mediterranean with cables. There are many more global gateway projects concerning the Mediterranean, and all of them are about connectivity, energy, transport, and the idea to connect north and south of the Mediterranean. Of course, we have also to structure this cooperation and dialogue with regional organizations such as the Union for the Mediterranean or the Analyst Foundation, and we have to reflect this year on these instruments, their visibility and their tools. The third priority is to continue to reinforce the role of the EU in addressing ongoing crises and conflicts and contribute to stabilization in the region. So I mentioned earlier MEPP, I mentioned Syria, but I could also mention crises which are coming and that we are following closely, like the situation in Tunisia or in Lebanon. We will continue to organize, as I say, our usual rendezvous like the Brussels conference for Syria or the ASLC for the Palestinians. And of course, we are a key humanitarian partner. We pledged 2 weeks ago our biggest amount to Yemen, and we were quite disappointed about the conference, but our pledge was the biggest. And of course, we have some hopes concerning Yemen and the possibility to extend the truce. We have also some hopes concerning Libya, where the security situation is better, and where we hope that the UN SRJ will find all the support of everybody. I will stop on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this picture of the EU priorities in the region. And I'd like to go more in depth on some aspects, on some crisis, a source of instability in the region, and how the EU is dealing with this source of instability. And I think of, for example, tensions between Algeria and Morocco that have increased over the past year. So, Dalia, how this tension will impact both EU-Algeria and EU-Morocco relations?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is one of the few cold conflict, if I may say, that has been poisoning the region for decades between these two neighbors. But recently, the situation escalated between Algeria and Morocco, and this escalation between the two countries was due to 5 events that made Algiers very worrisome. The first one was the attack on Sahrawi demonstration in El Gargarat. The second one was there was a tweet from President Donald Trump, announcing U.S. recognition of Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara. This made Algiers very pissed. The third event was the Moroccan ambassador to the UN when he decided to distribute a note expressing support for the movement for an autonomous movement in Kabylia, calling for the autonomy of Kabylia. And there was the vast spying scandal with Pegasus scandal, according to international newspapers and a human rights organization. Morocco targeted no less than 6,000 Algerians. And finally, there was the killing of the 3 Algerian soldiers in an attack. But I would say the most important element was the Israeli card, if I may call it like that. The fact that Morocco signed the Abraham Accords made Algiers very worrisome, very worried. Algiers I don't see, Algeria normalizing any time with Israel. And I think, when we know really well the foreign policy of the country, but also the history of this country, we can't imagine the country throwing the Palestinians nor the Sahrawi under the bus. And so one cannot, expect any change in Algeria's foreign policy on these two subjects. So Algiers sees the arms supply also and intelligence cooperation between Morocco and Israel as a danger to its sovereignty. And this is another element that adds, if I may say, fuel and to this very tense relationship. And, lately Morocco has been lobbying at the African Union for Israel to have an observer seat. And we've seen, videos of how this went. Algeria with 14 other countries, including South of Africa, succeeded in, blocking the move and suspending the decision. But if it shows us anything, it shows us that this problem is bigger than Algeria and Morocco. It's reaching the African Union. And really, I insist on that, saying that this is a thorn in the hands of the African Union. And what it means more disunity between Africans. And this is a dispute that has an impact, Valeria, on the present and the future of more than 100 million Maghrebi, because it diminishes, not to say paralyzes regional collaboration and integration. Just to give you a figure, in 2019, trade between Maghreb countries, meaning, Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, stood at 2.8% of the group total, compared to 58% with the rest of Africa. The Maghreb underperforms compared to the Gulf Cooperation Council, to the GCC. So again, this is a really important topic, but I do understand that the European Union, doesn't know how exactly to deal with that. But I think one of the things that we can look at is, first of all, try to reconnect the two countries to have more dialogue. Maybe, try to do that behind the scene, with baby steps. One of the things that I always think about is the business community. It will be great, to have a meeting with the business community from the two sides, so they can tell us what the closure of the frontiers of the borders mean to trade between and means to their business, between the two countries. Another thing that we can think about is the African Union. The African Union has this mediation tool, but it is very weak because it doesn't have the means, to train people and so on and so forth. And maybe the European Union can invest in this African tool mediation, African Union tool. And maybe we can, it's very important to give ownership to the people in this particular conflict, because otherwise, whoever will come it will be, accused of interference. And we do know how these two North African countries are very jealous about their sovereignty.
Thank you, Dalia. So let's turn our look to the other side of the Mediterranean, to Turkey. And we have seen that over the past year, Turkey has strengthened its relationship, its economic, above all, its economic relationship with Russia. So how and in which area can the EU strengthen in its cooperation with Turkey in light of these developments between Turkey and Russia? So, Eduard.
Sure. Well, the first thing that should be said is that Turkey has not only strengthened relations with Russia in the last 3-4 years, also after a short crisis that they had over the Syria war with sanctions and all the rest, but also with Ukraine. If you speak to any Ukrainian, they would characterize Turkey as a friendly country, as an ally, as one that has withstand in calling for the respect of sovereignty, of territorial integrity, including Crimea, with whom, as you know, there is a particular relation of intimacy between Turkey and Crimean Tatars. So that's also an aspect that makes Turkey a special case. A country that is perceived by both Russia and Ukraine as a friendly one. That's quite exceptional, I would say. The second is that Turkey is not only a relevant country in the Russia-Ukraine war, because also, if only because it's a riparian state of the Black Sea and because of the strategic importance of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, but also a country that is very much affected by the war in Ukraine, economically, also because the economic situation before was already quite difficult. It's only getting worse in terms of inflation, daily life cost, also food security. So a country that has a lot to lose because of the negative economic consequences of the war in Ukraine, but also one that it would be very much affected and vulnerable should Russia consider it as a hostile country. And here it's something that we tend to forget, perhaps in the European Union, but Russia is not only Turkey's northern neighbor across the Black Sea, but also Turkey's southern neighborhood because of its role in Syria. Therefore, Russia could play, if we would consider Turkey to be a hostile actor, all its cards, and it has too many in Syria to make things difficult for Turkey and for its leadership. This explains us why Turkey has pursued this balancing act, as they like to call it, in relation to Russia and Ukraine, because they just cannot afford to get at odds with Moscow, and because they already saw how it was in the year 2015. And Turkey is under NATO's umbrella, indeed, but it's not under the EU's umbrella when it comes to all the solidarity mechanisms we have within the EU in order to face with the social and economic consequences of the war in Ukraine. And just to add to that, as we all know, Turkey will go to elections in May 14. So this also adds another element of political survival of the current leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Therefore, to what extent this leads to more cooperation between the EU and Turkey? Not necessarily, because the starting positions are very different. But certainly it means that the EU should, and I think it already acknowledges Turkey's role, Turkey's importance, Turkey's potential also contribution to finding a solution to the conflict, if only because the two main contending parties, Russia and Ukraine, and I would like to insist a lot on that, both Kyiv and Moscow consider Turkey to be a relevant player. Therefore, the EU and NATO cannot but consider Turkey a relevant actor, and one with at least they should be talking with regarding how to solve the conflict.
Thank you, Eduard. We have received a few interesting questions from the audience, but unfortunately we have just 5 minutes left. So I pick one to all of you, and I ask you please to answer very, very briefly. The one is related to Saudi Arabia and Iran rapprochement thanks to the Chinese mediation. So the question is China increasing a role a threat or an opportunity to the European interest in the region? Hélène, please. Your opinion. You are muted.
Thank you very much. Well, external powers have always been very active in the MENA region, be it China or Russia or the US, and also regional powers. We've just talked about Turkey, but we could have talked about Saudi Arabia, Israel, or Iran. So yes, China is there. China is a competitor for the EU, in particular in the economic field. We spoke about global gateways. China has its own projects for the region, but the EU is still the main trade and investment partner of the MENA region as a whole. So I think we are competitor, but not we can go in the same direction. The KSA-Iran agreement is very good news. There have been other very good news in the past, like the Abraham Accord. So it shows that the region is in a perpetual evolution, and that we have to adapt to it. Thank you. Very briefly.
Thank you, Hélène. Great. Dalia, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I have to say, I totally agree with Hélène, and I would say, that when it comes to China in the GCC and China in the Maghreb, it is two different dynamics. China is very active in GCC, but its presence in the Maghreb, by opposition to what we think, and I just gonna publish a piece on that about China and India in the Maghreb, meaning defined as Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. The presence of these two Asian giants is to be, taken into we shouldn't exaggerate that presence. The European Union remained the first partner, economic partner, trade partner, but also it remains, this actor with which the region has its cultural and historical ties. I don't see, Maghrebi people emulating at any rate Chinese lifestyle or Chinese culture. And so the European Union has, a card to play, especially in North Africa. And again, as Hélène said, I mean, the deal between KSA and Iran is a very good, news for the region, and we hope for more because the region is in need of more unity.
Thank you, Dalia. Eduard, to conclude.
But then I fully agree. I mean, an agreement between two countries that are at odds in our neighborhood, it's good news. Regardless of who broke that agreement. But at the same time, what it is clear, it's also the extent to which the countries, particularly regional powers in the Middle East and North Africa, are taking advantage of the rivalry and competition among the great powers. So in that respect, not only China is interested to be more influential in the Middle East, but I would say that also many regional powers are interested in seeing more active China in the Middle East because it allows them to play with the global rivalries between the Europeans, the Russians, the Americans, and the Chinese. But ultimately, among all the candidates, I would say that at least we Europeans, we have many points of common interests with the Chinese, be it stability, energy security, freedom of navigation. So that could allow us also for interesting conversations between Europeans and Chinese on Middle Eastern affairs, despite all the other aspects where we may disagree.
Thank you very much, Eduard. Unfortunately, we have to conclude this very interesting discussion and debate. I really enjoyed, and let me thank again Hélène Lagal, Dalia Ghanem, and Eduard Soler Lecha for being with us this afternoon. Thanks to all of you for following us, and I wish you a very good afternoon. See you next time.
Thank you. Buon pomeriggio.
Buon pomeriggio.